Order, order. Welcome to today's meeting of the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy. Today's session is focusing on Pillar 3 of the National Security Strategy, which focuses on the sovereign capabilities and the asymmetric challenges. Can I just invite our first panel of witnesses to introduce themselves very briefly from my left, your right.
Hello, my name is Anthony Finkelstein. I'm by background a computer scientist and software engineer. Originally, my roles were at Imperial College and UCL. I am a former Chief Scientific Advisor for National Security and a former member of UKRI Council. I'm currently Chair of the Police Science Council, of the Research Security Advisory Board for DCIT, and I'm a non-executive director of the National Crime Agency and a major UK financial institution. My day job is as President and Vice Chancellor of City St George's, University of London, and I blog as Prof Serious on Substack.
Very good.
Amazing.
Yes, I'm Nigel Shadbolt. I'm a Professor of Computer Science at the University of Oxford and also co-founder and executive chair of the Open Data Institute. By background, I too am a computer scientist. I've been working in the field of artificial intelligence since the late 70s, and that's 1970s. I've held research positions in Edinburgh University, Nottingham University, Southampton University, and now Oxford. Various roles. Currently, I am a member of the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology, and I am the chair of AI at Oxford Research, which attempts to coordinate research across the University of Oxford, and also sit on a number of boards, non-executive director roles, as an advisor in the area of AI investments.
Thank you very much. So we've already been exploring Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 of the NSS, and this really is about looking at Pillar 3 and trying to understand about the government's view on our sovereign and asymmetric capabilities. Do you think that the strategy sets out a very clear vision of those? And what, in terms of the terms themselves, what do you understand by them? Sir Anthony.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Some of the terminology which appears in the NSS, in fact, has its distant origin in terminology that appeared originally in the integrated review. That in turn stems from a paper I had some hand in authoring, for which reason I feel like I've got quite a big stake in the terms and their meanings. So I understand strategic advantage to be about a durable and asymmetric edge, one that gives the UK a differentiating capability that competitors cannot easily replicate, substitute, or remove. It's not only about superiority in technology, but about a position from which the UK can generate prosperity, resilience, security, and influence over time. In technology domains, advantage is often indirect as well as direct. Leadership in one capability confers leverage in products, services, systems, and so on, built upon them. For advantage to be meaningful, it must also be commercially grounded. Market forces ultimately determine that durability. The state's role is, I believe, to shape the conditions in which markets generate sustainable advantages. Strategic advantage is built from several interlocking components. I appreciate the time constraints, but just very quickly, informational advantage, understanding your competitors' intentions and capabilities, positional advantage, control of critical assets, temporal advantage, being ahead, logistic advantage, being able to get resources to the problem rapidly and effectively, resource advantage, essentially access to capital, materials and economic leverage, knowledge advantage, critical know-how, skills advantage, which we may return to, I guess, adaptive advantage, which is the ability to pivot, learn and reconfigure. And I commend the strategy for identifying that that may well be an important element of it. Values advantage, which is about the legitimacy, openness and challenge embedded in our democratic systems that underpin scientific excellence and public trust, and collaborative advantage, which is alignment with like-minded allies, however occasionally difficult that might be, to amplify capability and constrain adversaries. And basically, national advantage, a national strategy needs to optimize the combination of all of those different asymmetries.
Thank you. Nigel.
I think that's a very good summary. I think the other thing that we should bear in mind is, as we are looking at this landscape that is very fast evolving, and particularly in my own field of AI, strategic advantage and certainly asymmetric advantage will derive from part of the distinctive history and heritage of the work we've done and completed in the United Kingdom, the kind of institutions that we've built that allow us to continue to be world class in this area. So I would just add that dimension. And also data is a key part of our strategic advantage. We often think of a variety of infrastructures as being essential to our resilience and security, whether that be our power grids or our communication networks. But actually, data itself is properly understood as an infrastructure, and properly curated and managed confers strategic advantage.
So you think that should be the absolute dominant first priority?
It's one of the priorities, and actually I would suggest that data does not figure, although it's mentioned on a number of occasions, it doesn't figure as this underpinning foundational component.
What do you think, Sir Anthony? What do you think should be the...
So, I mean, for the key feature I would suggest that we've got to remember with the modern generation of machine learning techniques is their absolute dependence on data, some of it good, bad and indifferent, and there the challenge is of course to screen and fine-tune models to be better able to deal with poor quality data. So investments around data as an infrastructure, to understand that it needs to be assured, curated, ideally its provenance noted, becomes a key demand, I'd say, a requirement, and too often not enough attention is given to the investment that would require and the sort of regulation that would keep, maintain and sustain it as an essential part of the infrastructure.
Anthony, what would you say would be should be the absolute first priority?
So my first observation is that rather than thinking of particular technologies or areas of technology, as it were, individually, we think of this as, in essence, and I apologize for the terminology, a game on a network. In other words, what we've got is a network of related and dependent technologies, and we're seeking to play advantage over that network of related technologies and assets. Hence, I agree with Nigel on data, for example.
Okay. Many observers have said that of the three pillars, that this is the least developed of the three. Tech UK have said there's not enough detail in there. ADS also said we want to see more information about what areas we should be looking at owning, accessing, or collaborating on. What do you think the government needs to do to create a tighter framework to help the private sector better understand what the challenge is?
go first. Yeah.
Okay. The first thing I'd like to say is that, in general, our overall HMG capacity to gather and analyse scientific and technical intelligence is inadequate. We do not know enough. This is not here talking about necessarily covertly acquired intelligence, but actually open source intelligence. We do not really know enough about the global laydown of technological competition, and we need to do so. And I think we need to develop an associated analytic tradecraft that allows us to form fine-grained strategy. So I wouldn't say that the Pillar 3 is inadequate. I would say it's fine as far as it goes, which isn't that far.
You agree with that, Nigel?
Yes, and I think that the challenge is then to understand what do we need to survey? What should our horizon scanning look like? What should our intelligence gathering in the broadest sense? So as academics, we are constantly looking and actually having to deal with the extraordinary deluge of research that is now available. It in itself is a significant challenge for which we turn to various tools, analytics tools, to help us. But without that, it's hard to get a strong sense of just how fast changing this field is and how certainties of just 12 months ago change into, maybe things aren't quite so obvious. So again, if I were to take the current generation of enthusiasms for so-called large language models or foundation models, it's quite clear there is massive speciation happening in this space. Models large and small, models open and closed, models that are specialized or tuned to particular domains. And this is a really important factor to understand. We are likely to begin to see a landscape emerge with very, very different types of AI capability just in this one area, suited to running on everything from mobile phones to distributed networks to the very large-scale cloud infrastructures that we understand. And strategic asymmetry should not be seen as a guarantee to try and master or indeed give up on the attempt to build a very large language model on the scale that are available in some of the hyperscalers. And that will be an issue I'd like to come back to, because I think understanding that is an important part of the whole landscape of understanding how to behave.
We will definitely come back to that.
Yep.
Lord Tunnicliffe.
I've come across this concept of this Pillar 3, and I've also addressed it from one direction, and that is from the military direction in my own mind. And the more I thought of that, the more often I came across something that I've found throughout my career, and that is there's not enough discussion as to why. There's lots of wonderful science to do and so on and so forth. But we are 60 million people, and our competitor here is not the Russians, our competitor is the Americans. And we cannot have surely a broad spectrum approach to try and everything they do. We have to have a more sophisticated approach, which targets where we take our limited resources to lever big advantages. And surely that's not a matter of sitting back and letting the market forces answer that question. The question, firstly, surely must be handled by government and then transmitted into a relationship with industry where the right resources go to the right questions to produce the right result.
Who'd like to start?
I'll make a start. So the first thing to say is that I broadly think that the priority areas identified by government and amplified in UKRI's strategy are indeed the right areas for us to have a national focus on. I think they're reasonably well chosen. But what I would say is that they are very broad and high level. And I don't think that's good foundation for a competitive strategy. So if we are identifying, as we are in Pillar 3, the idea that we are going to take a highly competitive national approach, then I think we're going to need to refine those questions. I think that was the implied by your question. We're going to have to refine those questions further. I don't think we're well positioned to do that at the moment.
Yeah, I think that the notion of what we are both incredibly capable of delivering, we know from our kind of core science base. We have a strong sense of what that is, and it's not all of health and life science, but it's a substantial component. We have extraordinary capabilities in quantum. Whether we can ever scale these things, classic problem of we do the basic science and have a translational problem or a patient capital problem. And it's the same, I would submit, in material science and in AI. What we can do is identify where the potential disruption points are. Very large bets are being made at the moment on particular styles of delivering AI and particular types, and some of the assumptions are rather unquestioned about whether that is an appropriate focus. That the only way to compete is to imagine building these super large models, for example, and one has to be very thoughtful about whether that conveys advantage. That is the kind of discussion we need to get in. The grain size of the discussion has to be at the level of where does our science give us an inherent advantage? Where do we know world-class science is being done? And where do we think that may confer fairly rapid market advantage? Because the gap between developing these methods and their deployment in the market is extraordinarily short.
If I may say, I think that much of our methodologies for determining research and other priorities are well suited to a situation sort of absent a competitive setting. When you have a competitive setting, you suddenly start to think, well, how can we hold choke points? How can we hold particular knowledge assets which make our position difficult to shift? So this is a much more sort of strategic form of thinking, more akin to what's been done historically in the national security community than has been what's been done in the research community.
I think that takes us neatly on to Daisy.
Thank you very much, Chair. Gents, the National Security Strategy aims to develop a baseline level for sovereign capability in key frontier technologies such as AI and quantum computing. However, you will no doubt have noted that the level of sovereignty required, for example, in supply chains or production capability, is not even addressed in the Defence Industrial Strategy. Also, if we look at autonomy, the Defence Industrial Strategy does not even state the different levels of autonomy to be applied. So, Professor Finkelstein, if I may start with your good self, what should that baseline look like for these different technologies?
Okay, so I believe that the baseline can't be determined bottom up from the technologies. I think it also derives from what one might think of as threat scenarios. So I would prefer to take a more scenario-based approach to thinking about how one secures sovereignty in particular technologies. We need to center on knowledge sovereignty, the minimum scientific and technical understanding required for the UK to act as a smart customer, assure supply chains, and if necessary, the capacity to bootstrap. My inclination is not to think we need to maintain, as it were, a baseline capacity in each of the underlying technologies. Right. So it's scenarios first, basically.
Okay. Professor Shadbolt, obviously, no doubt you will agree with me that there is a lack of clarity around these issues from the government. So what do you think should be the baseline?
I think it will be the issue about securing supply chains, particularly when you're at the material level. When you're at the kind of chip assembly, there is some concern that perhaps we too easily imagine we're incapable of being innovative around the fundamental design and innovation of the silicon fabric on which, or indeed potential new fabrics, compute fabrics such as quantum, upon which technologies depend. And I think that's, if you look at our historical ability to innovate in this space, that would be odd. It's clearly the case that when investments have been made, really very interesting developments have arisen. We have been at frontier in the past. We don't invest enough time thinking about where our core capability is to develop new styles of technology. But I think if you move up the stack, there's a very interesting area where sovereignty also becomes an interesting style. It's the ability to validate and verify the complex systems that now exist to be much more powerful and effective in establishing the security of these systems, their performance envelopes. And that, again, is something where the UK has very strong traditions. And I would recommend that we need to think at each level in the stack as we abstract higher up to fully emergent services where the UK can actually secure its own capability. The big argument will be around, should the UK be building its own frontier model? What would that look like? And again, I think we can refactor that in a more interesting way than is often understood. And I would commend that we look at countries like China and Switzerland who are making some very interesting bets in how you might do that.
Just to say, to round out an answer to this, I hope we'll have an opportunity in subsequent question to talk a little bit about skills, because skills clearly play into baseline capability, and they are an area where I judge the UK currently to be most vulnerable, or at any rate to know least about its vulnerabilities.
Professor Finkelstein, great minds think alike, because that's exactly what I was hoping to question you on next. But two questions, if I may, with yourself. Firstly is with regards to barriers. So the barriers to achieving that baseline, which we've just discussed. So if you can just answer regarding that. And secondly, our Defence Committee indeed has looked into skills gaps. There's a lot that the government, the Ministry of Defence wants to achieve in terms of our military capability. But we're seeing again and again that there is a huge skills gap. So in your mind, given your expertise, are there any technologies where those skills gaps exist, which you have just alluded to? And more importantly, how are we going to address those skills gaps?
So I've mentioned already the S&T intelligence and the analytic tradecraft. Clearly, I am concerned about the erosion of domestic capability, particularly in technically mature but strategically essential areas. On my list are RF engineering, propulsion, metals, ceramics, acoustics, energetics, and electro-optics.
Right.
But that's just a first pass, and I know that you have others more expert who might follow on. Other obstacles are limited stickiness of early stage innovation, and the UK struggles to anchor emerging technologies and talent domestically. We have insufficient routes for rapid acquisition. Defence and national security procurement often lag market evolution. On the broader thing, the thing we badly need in the UK is a comprehensive skills and capability audit. We just don't have an understanding of where we have skills shortages, and then we need a preservation scheme for fragile or declining areas. And this is not just something for government, it's also something for industry. We need industry to take a long-term collaborative view of niche skills. I believe this erosion in underlying skill space is slow, but ultimately more dangerous than crisis shocks.
Okay, Professor Shadbolt, if you can just come in on the barriers as well as how we're going to address the skills gaps, please.
So I can tell you from my own institution's perspective, we have 20 well-qualified applicants for every place in our computer science courses. There is a massive opportunity to train the brightest and the best in these core technologies, all the way through to the kind of level of apprenticeships we know are required and new professions that are beginning to emerge. So the notion of a profession of data insurance, a new set of skills required to actually evaluate and understand the qualities of data that are being used in every kind of sector, is a new sort of professional qualification that, again, we need to prepare for. So this isn't just about securing existing talent pipelines, it's about anticipating where these new jobs will emerge. And just to say, the notion that all the jobs will be taken by AI systems, one problem we do have is a freezing lag that we're beginning to see, where a reticence to take on new interns across a range of professions suggests that those organizations feel that somehow it's a given deal that systems will simply be imported that fulfill those tasks, and what you then lose is the deep embedded training that those internships provide for, and you're in danger of a demographic gap, literally, when people then realize, oh, we should have probably not frozen our hiring in quite these contexts in the way we did. What do we then do to reinstate, to backfill that deeply hard-won expertise that human skilled workers often acquire in internships?
Thank you. Liam Byrne.
Thanks. Sansley, let me just check first of all, do you think the national security strategy actually defines the sovereign capabilities that the country needs clearly enough?
Well, I mean, I think in all honesty it does not. But I'm wondering whether or not a strategy of this kind would be the best place to do that. And I wonder whether perhaps it's whether or not it's done a halfway, whether or not it's sort of halfway done the job, and it might be a better choice either to say this is for a separately commissioned piece of associated analytic work, or Pillar 3 needs to be fuller. I think it would be a judgment call.
The Defence Industrial Strategy says we will define sovereign capabilities, but then doesn't define them either. So do you think, where do you think it should be defined and when?
So I think this needs to be a continuing process, because we're in a dynamic, competed setting. So it cannot be static. And my assumption would be that this is something that would best emerge from a continuing analytic capability.
If we went to China, say, I mean, do you think China has got a pretty good grip on the sovereign capabilities it wants for China?
Do you want to try that
Well,
one?
I mean,
Or pick another.
I mean,
Rival.
just to perhaps continue with what Anthony was saying, I do think that the term isn't made out in much detail. I think that a crisper view, certainly operationally, could serve us, and I think that is something we should think about. So sovereign capability in AI means having the ability to not only develop or own or host systems, but to understand, test and govern them. So I think we can get under the skin of what a sovereign capability, to evaluate whether they behave safely, to identify failure modes. And there are failure modes that we're beginning to see now, for which a sovereign capability could be super important. You know, are these systems capable of being deceptive? Are these systems capable of having their reward functions hacked in various ways to give very undesirable behaviour?
I mean, I think that's useful, but if I just go back to what was listed in the National Security Strategy, so they talked about nuclear deterrent, nuclear subs, cryptography. There's then a list which is described as a list where we need varied levels of autonomy, combat airships, ground combat systems, complex weapons, munitions, and then about another 6 sectors where action is needed: steel, construction, energetic material, batteries, semiconductors, rare earths. I mean, it just all sounds a bit vague. So the question I've really got, I suppose, is that list right? What obvious is missing? And B, is it a clear enough list for the private sector to actually act on?
So the answer, I mean, as I previously alluded to, I don't think that these lists are adequate, and I do want much finer grain, much more intelligence-informed assessments framed around the competitive setting. Mm-hmm. I've looked at now to your earlier question, which I've recovered sufficiently to answer. I've looked at the open source material on Chinese technology priorities. They are not an enormous distance from the material that is available publicly from HMG. The point is, I want to do better. If that's your competitor's baseline, I would actually seek to secure an edge by better analysis, if that were possible.
Yeah. So Nigel, your views on anything obvious missing from the list, except there's a process that one as a nation might go through to evolve it, and I take the point about this needing to be a living list. But what about this clarity for the private sector? I mean, ultimately these things are going to be built with substantial amounts of private sector investment. But if there's no clear market signals, then the market ain't going to help quite as we might like.
No, I think that's right. I think that the market signals in this area as well may or may not serve you well. The interest that we currently see in, for example, China's adaptation of AI systems to fulfill a range of specific capabilities within their industrial base, with their educational base, within their scientific base. To Anthony's point, they give us the clue that we're perhaps broadly pursuing what each nation would think of it as strategic aims. But yes, how can we do better? How can we use the intrinsic features of an open and democratic system to actually further enrich and empower the models that we are now using in AI? And that is a real prize. The one thing that you can be sure of is that the models in the Chinese context are variously constrained and limited in ways that will not provide for the full range of effective deployment that you might find here in the UK.
May I also say that there's commend an aspect of NSIF's that is the National Security Strategic Investment Fund's approach, which is open dialogues round problem books, which is, I think, a model of how such engagement could be done.
Final question then, who's in charge of developing this list and leading the process to get the living list that we've just agreed would be a virtuous thing to have?
I think we have to kind of imagine that is a discussion we can do between the public and private, but also academic institutions have to be a part of this, and the academies as well. This is an organised dialogue you can have. I don't think it sits with any one single department or indeed one single set of governance. Regulators play a role here too. We haven't yet talked about the essential role that they might play in helping boost our innovative capability.
But I mean, is this dialogue going to start itself? And have
No,
the-
I mean, I think it needs to be something that we orchestrate, and actually this is where
who's the
a
we?
national strategy perhaps might want to sit down and say, well, how do we bring these voices into a discussion?
Who's the first mover in this dialogue?
I mean, the challenge is that a national security strategy of this kind requires a systems approach which government finds difficult to achieve. Perhaps a fusion approach might be. I might look at somebody here and things, but it requires us to articulate mechanisms across government. I think that the security cross-cutting strand in government has strengthened the linkage between the economic departments and the traditional security departments, but it's not all it could be.
Okay.
And if we speak up for the academies here, I would say that they do lead pieces of work, and the work that has been recently completed by the Royal Society around AI in science is a great example that highlights where the strengths are and where the opportunities live.
Okay.
So
Let's move. Edwin Morello, you want to come in?
To be honest, I think both professors have pretty much answered the question I was going to ask, which was just to allude to the point that traditionally government isn't particularly good at keeping up with the pace of change, and when you have very sort of loose articulation of what the need is, and I think Sir Nigel, you alluded to how bad the UK is at rapid procurement. I mean, actually, how do you create the granularity that's needed to direct people without creating a straitjacket that results in us going down and effectively creating a situation where we're uncompetitive with our enemies?
I mean, I think we're seeing in the not yet released but much anticipated kind of reframing of what UKRA funding will look like in the university system. We're seeing it in the AI Opportunities Report that there was a clear sense of what could be done. The issue of whether we've stood up the resource in the right place to realise it is something that kind of exercises on the Council for Science and Technology, is that you have a commitment to a national data library. Will that be realised in the way that a government is able to procure and operationalise that concept quickly over the data that matters? And I think that is always the challenge here, is how can you get a red teaming mentality into these areas and trust them to get the job done, and not bury them in endless amounts of complex procurement, because speed to action is important. So again, working, I think, with the universities who are having to adapt and moderate in the speed with which my own field is changing, and the application of AI to particular areas in science, engineering, health, is a lesson in miniature of the challenges of communities that are trying to respond quickly in terms of the skills we need our graduates to have, our postdoctoral students to have, the resources we need in the laboratory, and the data we need to have access to. And we can actually find great use cases in that space. Do we have the courage to trust them to get on and get on with the task of strategic delivery?
When I joined government, a very senior MOD former official said to me, he said, "My dear boy, whenever we have a very difficult SPAD, we just point them towards defence procurement, and then they're gone for the next few years."
Now we know the root of all the problems. Baroness Kidron.
So I think my question sort of follows on naturally, just thinking about the frontier technologies. And I note that you both talked about knowledge, assets and choke points and so on. And given that the frontier is so huge, what should we be looking at specifically as a, sovereign proposal for the UK? Maybe Sir Nigel, you'd like to start.
Okay, well, we know our health data is extraordinary, and not just our health, our social care data. It's rung around with challenges around how we present that in a way that looks like an opportunity and doesn't raise all sorts of concerns around expropriation by particular sorts of private interest. Again, the NHS suffers from some of the same challenges of procurement that the Defence Department does. The idea of being able to stand up experiments and demonstrations of the art of the possible. We do understand what some of these environments can look like. I point to the work in Oxford of Ben Goldacre's Open Safely work, which is safely looking to find patterns in all of NHS England's patient data, primary GP patient data, but it's actually running into obstacles because of procurement and licensing conditions that exist in a fractured, complicated governance structure. So sometimes our challenge is in the way we try and adapt existing governance to get the technology we know exists liberated and used in a proportionate way. So health would be one. Our social care data, educational, longitudinal educational data is the second one. We have really quite well curated data assets in major areas of the economy and in major areas that relate to social provisioning and care that could be opened up. And that's without moving into issues about what exists in our cultural heritage domains.
So the sort of asymmetry that you were talking about in the first question, these are the assets that you think the UK can create asymmetry with.
And my fear is that the siren call of getting large amounts of compute to solve the problem for us will lead us to give access to these extraordinary resources at massively discounted value.
Can I just push you on that, because my second question, and I am coming to you, sorry.
Okay.
My second question was really around what does sovereign mean in this context? Because I'm thinking about the US-UK trade deal, for example, and whether that, and some of the announcements that I read in the newspaper about access to government data or who we should give it to. So where's the sovereign bit in what you've just said?
Well, clearly that is the essence of the discussion, which is it entirely clear what would be the nature of any compute availability for the data availability? And has that trade-off been properly understood and reasonable economics models provided of what the opportunity cost in doing that is? I'm not against these deals at all. I think it's probably a very important way forward. But let us be clear and not woefully undervalue the inherent and intrinsic long-term value of those data assets built up over many decades of public purse investment. And we have poor models for actually estimating the value of those public data assets.
Thank you.
So look, I do have a sort of top 10 list of tech that I think are that I think lie beyond somewhat HMG's priority areas that I think we should pay attention to build on Nigel's earlier point. One clear area where we have strong UK capability which could be leveraged to national security strategy benefit is UK strength in the social sciences. Our ability in the social and behavioural sciences may well confer advantages which I think we know that some of our competitor states could not achieve because of their other disadvantages. So, privacy-enhancing technologies, novel sensors, edge compute, behavioural analytics, adversarial AI, smart environments and cities, smart materials, micro-robotics, and neuroscience are my top 10.
I'm grateful for your list, and can I just ask the previous list of skills that you gave us? do those two lists marry, or is no?
They're orthogonal.
I did not think so. So I think that I would like you to just sort of say a little bit about skills in this area, because some of these areas feel under pressure in our academic community.
I mean, I think that we have a risk associated with with current strategic thinking about how research spending is to be made, in that we may over-concentrate and lose this penumbra of critical technologies that I think would serve our national security interests. In my earlier observations, I feel like there are areas where for certain we need to keep a baseline UK skills base, the most obvious illustration being RF engineering, and unlike Nigel's earlier description of a queue of researchers queuing up for that, we don't have a queue of domestic researchers queuing up for those areas, and that's a worry.
This is my final question, but I'm just interested in the connection between Sir Nigel saying we're not seeing interns going in to get sort of, if you like, analogue skills that they may need in these new frontier technologies over time, and the sort of hysteria about AI investment. And I'm just interested whether you think there is any UK advantage in this moment while everyone's very distracted by the hyperscalers.
I think there could be, and I think that's and the other area where we have an interesting, developed and growing capability, and this may sound, is in the values. It's in the actual understanding of the so-called alignment of these technologies. In AI, model alignment is all about ensuring that these models actually conform to the kinds of rules and norms that you expect them to follow. And that we've got both in the kinds of institutions that are set up across the UK, ethics in AI, very, very strong work around alignment within the AI Security Institute. Yeah. One thing I would just like to say on this, one thing that I think is important on the skills story is we have if we have an asymmetry, we have it between the supply of talent out of our universities and the somewhat extractive industry that is the very, very notable companies that sit alongside developing this technology. The grab for talent is so competitive that very often graduates who could well do with more time in the lab to develop those skills, and I've heard this just very recently from CEOs who say, we think this is unbalanced. We'd much rather you retain some of your key research graduates a little longer to round them out, and coming up with a better balanced compact between industry and academic research could be.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing to I've made.
Keep it fairly brief.
Yes,
because we're running out of time.
I've made some advantage in my personal career by looking at what the most able people are doing and doing something slightly to the side of it.
Okay.
And that's generally not a bad.
I think that's a great lesson for the committee. Thank you, Chair.
Gavin.
Thank you ever so much, Mr. Chairman. The National Security Strategy makes only limited reference to the role of data and data policy in national security. And should we be seeking to do more in this area?
I absolutely think so. I mean, from my earlier comments, the Open Data Institute has run a number of reports and surveys on data quality indices, what we know about the deployment of various data training assets, both in as the models are being trained from the outside and then subsequently fine-tuned. Much more attention to this is part of our it would be an asymmetric strength that we could possess.
I thought it was really fascinating, you sort of saying that we don't really understand the value of the information that we have. And I sometimes feel there's a little bit of a naivety in this country. I mean, if you look at health data, if you look at someone like BGI Genomics that are harvesting a vast amount of data, yet they've been sort of linked with Chinese military, even sort of doing, repression of ethnic minorities through that data. Countries such as the US have already labelled them like a significant risk. Do you think we've got to be less siloed in government and actually looking across the board as to where some of these emerging threats are coming from?
I'm sure we do. I mean, I think that constant kind of recognition of where attention is being put, particularly in terms of what data assets. We talked about the value of data assets. People often talk as if it's a set of given resources which we just have to put up with or repurpose. There is often not enough attention given to what new classes of data could we collect into the future that we should absolutely ensure is important data for this country's strategic well-being. One example I would give you from our earlier work in the Open Data Institute was the potential for automobile and platform data from intelligent cars, EVs, intelligent autonomous vehicles. What if a condition of licensing those was to actually provide some of that data for a public good, for a public purpose? For example, examining congestion, examining black spots, a whole range of potential, rather than just imagining that all has to end up in private silos, quite as well as government silos. So thinking ahead, and this was very much the lesson from the pandemic, what data would we have liked to have had in advance of that pandemic? And we can make some fair bets as classes of data we should be collecting right now.
Do you think government has to be just much more assertive? I imagine Lord Sedwell will be very in favour of this in terms of like the Cabinet Office should probably sort of have a bit more of an iron grip on these things, because actually when you're in a department you are always sort of to some extent operating as a silo, because if you're in health, all you want is the cheapest availability of doing something, whereas you're not necessarily always standing back and looking at the overall good. I mean, you've seen government from the inside and externally. What would be your dream of a cabinet secretary to say? I'll be honest with you, it's going to be a cabinet secretary as against a cabinet minister that will say this. Say to you, okay, we want you to lead this. How do you draw it forward?
Well, periodically we make some progress in this, or we take steps to imagine we're going to build up this much more kind of integrated view, for example, of what our data infrastructure could be. The problem is that doesn't often survive contact with political attention spans, and it seems to me to build this in as a core operating principle. It is an asset, it spans different departmental jurisdictions. It's not just about making it all open, though the more open foundational data you can have, the more you will get network effects off it. It's about understanding the different grades of data you've got and how you need to actually license them and secure them and understand intrinsic value in advance of connecting them up, and then building standards that allow for interoperability. Even if you choose not to share the data, use standards that anticipate that you might in an emergency. And this was, again, another great lesson from the use of mobile data and population movements.
Government is poorly set up, in my judgment, to deal with systems challenges, as I alluded to early. Personally, I do not think the solution to that is to concentrate greater control within the Cabinet Office. It is rather to provide a set of mechanisms that allow much more granular collaboration across government and escapes from the bind of the accounting officer model that at the moment makes it quite difficult for us to achieve the sort of systems impacts we need.
Thank you. Lord Sedwell.
Excuse me, thank you. Just want to touch on the wider domestic framework. I mean, just really picking up that point. The National Security Strategy includes a commitment to spend 86 billion, at least by the end of the decade, to drive up innovation. There's a series of different strategies that the government has produced bearing on the environment, the industrial trade strategies. The national security strategy itself asserts essentially that our national security imperatives and our economic competitiveness imperatives are, or at least can be, aligned. Is that true? Because it isn't necessarily the case. And what other action do you think, building on your last point, Professor Finkelstein, do you think government should be taking?
Well, the first thing is I commend to the committee an excellent paper by the think tank Restate. It's an essay called Everythingism. And in it, Joe Hill, who's the author of it, points to the slight habit of every policy seeking to do everything in government, and the consequences you submerge trade-offs, and you basically lose clarity of focus. And if I'm honest, I would say there are occasional touches of everythingism in National Security Strategy Pillar 3. For amusement, this weekend I blogged on something which I called Something Must Be Done, another related pathology, and members may wish to read that in their leisure.
Well, Sophrus, do you want to come in briefly?
Yes, just briefly. Sir Anthony, in terms of using private capital to fund some of these priorities, do you support that? Should there be limits on the involvement of private capital? Are there enough investors involved? Was everyone left for Dubai, or are there good groups left in this space?
Well, I'm delighted that NSIF has had increased funding proposed within the strategy. In general, I'm very pleased to see the expansion of NSIF. I think it gives out a very interesting model of how private capital and government direction can be usefully blended. If that were then combined with accelerated means of translating those technologies into application within government, that would be an improvement. The investment side of things is well treated. I think that clearly clear missions, strategic signalling, and procurement certainty will drive private capital further private capital engagement. But I think the NSIF model shows the way.
Thank you very much. Can I thank both our witnesses for your time today? That concludes our first panel of this session. We will now suspend as we change over panels. Order. Welcome back to today's meeting of the Joint Committee of the National Security Strategy. This is our second panel looking at the Pillar 3 of the National Security Strategy. Can I ask the witnesses just to introduce yourselves incredibly briefly? I'm sorry we're running over time. From my left.
Sure, I'm Hayden Gorkridger. I spent 23 years in the Army. I left in October last year. I spent the last 9 years of my life probably focused on Ukraine, either working in Ukraine or supporting Ukraine. My last job in the military was the director for the UK drone program for Ukraine for 2 years, and now I work for a drone startup heavily focused on supporting Ukraine.
Thank you.
Sophia Gaston, I'm a fellow in the Centre for Statecraft and National Security at King's College London, work on Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific defence, security and foreign policy.
I'm Blythe Crawford. I work for a defence startup called Tiberius Aerospace, where we're building the world's largest defence capability development platform. Until last week, I was in the Ministry of Defence, where I served for 34 years. For the last 10 years, I've been specifically focused on defence innovation, where my last job was running the Air and Space Warfare Centre, where we were focused on supporting our partners in Ukraine over the last 3 years.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you for your forbearance. We are running 15 minutes or so later than planned. We're due to be finishing around 6. Unfortunately, we are expecting some votes as well in about 20 minutes or so, which might cause some disruption. We may have to suspend the sitting. Apologies if that's the case, but if members could also just bear that in mind, and if it's possible to phase the voting, that would be appreciated. Let me hand over to Lord Watts.
The government has an ambition to strengthen the defence's industrial base. Have we now identified the weaknesses of our defence base? What are the lessons to be learned? And it's interesting you spent some time with Ukraine. What's the lessons to be learned from Ukraine? Because it seems to be quite successful in changing its own policies to be more effective and help it defend itself. How should we strengthen the defence industrial base? How do you think we should go about that?
Sorry, is that for me?
Yeah. Well, you can start because
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I come at this very much from a kind of practitioner's perspective. I had to utilise the defence industrial base in many ways to build a programme to support Ukraine. We found that pretty challenging, across a whole range of different areas. Whether we've talked about the previous panel talked about some of those areas, whether it's the availability of propulsion systems, whether it's motors, compute, whatever it is, to find kind of sovereign sources of those kind of capabilities is incredibly hard, and that does introduce a significant limitation when you're trying to build lots of something. Like the supply chain was inevitably the biggest problem when you were trying to do anything at scale. That still is very much the case. I think Ukraine has shown the ability to utilize global supply chains. There are now more limitations, for instance, for the Chinese supply of components than there were clearly in 2022, which has been significant. But that has given them enough time to essentially onshore some of those capabilities because they saw that coming. The signaling was there because obviously they're not trying to completely undermine, China wasn't trying to completely undermine itself, but they'd move quickly. So I think, but they do that with a very clear focus, and it's that focus that perhaps we miss. We've talked about areas that we could work in. What we haven't talked about is actual capabilities that are built on those areas using those skills that we would be in our national interest. That's it.
I think there are 4 key areas we need to focus on. Firstly, in terms of the key industrial areas such as development of munitions, and I know that there is an aspiration to build some new armaments factories in that regard. So key core capabilities, and for example, if you look at the war in Ukraine, for example, barrels for tanks, as an example, is a key area that we need to focus on. Secondly, I think there is a challenge around procurement. Our procurement process has been discussed obviously at length. but it was specifically designed around building aircraft carriers, tanks and planes, rather than the fast-moving and the fast-paced asymmetric capabilities that you're seeing being deployed in Ukraine today. And we do not have a system that is optimized for that. Thirdly, I would say that we need to widen the scope as to who's involved. And in terms of the support of the startup industry in Ukraine, obviously they have had to pivot to an entirely new model to be able to rapidly absorb those capabilities. There is also a fourth aspect, which is the fact that obviously the imperative there is that around national survival, and therefore it is a whole of nation approach. So how can you pivot from a scenario where furniture makers were making wardrobes last week, and then this week they're laser cutting, the frames for drones? So to sort of underpin some of the points made in the last session, national defence is a national endeavour, and therefore it needs to be a whole of nation approach to it, and particularly underpinned by national resiliency. So I would argue, one of the key questions we should be asking is, what is our national resiliency around those manufacturing capabilities, and what's our national resiliency around a whole of nation approach to defence and national security?
If I could just add one point on the lessons from Ukraine. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the way in which we've been able to support Ukraine is that obviously we've had this extraordinary procurement process, and it's been sort of ring-fenced and kept quite separate from procurement proper in the MOD. And it's really, I've spent the last few years trying to investigate the question of why we can't actually adapt some of these extraordinary processes to become more institutionalized, particularly in the context of other projects like AUKUS and so on, where pace is actually really crucial. And I suppose the conclusion that I draw from that is it really comes down to a fundamental challenge around risk appetite and the relationship between the civil service and the political officers. The reason we were able and willing to absorb institutionally the risk to have that extraordinary procurement process is because we had support from the highest levels politically, who were then able to give that directive and galvanize the system. So I think there's an important lesson in that too.
You've raised the issues. How well are we addressing those issues? And you've raised some solutions, but how near are we to finding those solutions?
So I would say that there are obviously measures being taken to address our procurement process. I'll be frank, I don't think they're necessarily ambitious enough, and I don't think we have necessarily put the timelines that we actually need to work at the pace we need to defend ourselves in delivery of that. There is a large debate going on at the moment around risk appetite. I worked very closely with the Defence Safety Agency, who regulate all of our activity in developing new capabilities for Ukraine. And by bringing them in at the beginning of the process and explaining to them what we were actually trying to achieve, we managed to, for example, in the development of the Raven surface-to-air system, do our test and evaluation in 3 days in what would normally have taken us 6 months. So I think the importance there to address some of that bureaucracy and process is getting the right people in the room at the right stage of the process, so as you're not surprising them further on downstream and them having to go reverse engineer what you've done already to get after it. I also think there is a challenge, though, around incentivization, because if we are going to challenge bureaucracy and process, what is the incentivization for those developing that policy and process? It's very easy to be incentivized when you're at war. If you're an end user, if you're a warfighter, you are incentivized by getting the job done and delivering something on the battlefield. But if you are sitting in Whitehall developing bureaucracy and process, which is the role of personnel within the civil service to do that, what is your incentivization to get after it in the same way as a warfighter would?
I've been very lucky to be one of those people sat in Task Force Kindred for a couple of years, being given the authority to spend £500 million on support of a programme that essentially I had the authority to manage, So I would say that is possible because it's been done today. There isn't, and it all comes down to, I think, how you measure the results of your actions. I think that was critically important. Kindred is still focused on the effect it's trying to achieve, not just the volume of things that are provided that do whatever they need potentially could do. It's, are they being used for something that's making a difference under, for the war in Ukraine now, or not? Because if they're not, don't do it. It's pretty simple. Even if maybe that is helpful to some companies outside of Ukraine. That would be my take.
If I may add a very quick point on the end of that.
Very briefly.
We talk about a term called a LARP in defence, as low risk, as low as is reasonably practicable. We tend to misconstrue the word practicable with possible. So we tend to drive risk as low as we possibly can rather than what is appropriate for the scenario.
Okay, very useful, thank you. Let me just turn to autonomous systems. Government has committed $4 billion to this area. There's much talk, of course, in the aerial sphere. But what do you know in terms of the development of other platforms in other spheres? Maybe you, Hayden.
Yeah,
Hayden,
sure.
Sorry.
Hayden, sure. Obviously there are some very expensive autonomous systems. Let's be clear. Protector is not a cheap autonomous system. So when you look at that kind of scale of money, a considerable amount of it will be spent on one particular system. I do think that
is this sort of innovation that we should be looking at, or looking at partnering with other nations on, or what?
I think the problem is that what I would say is we're continually chasing different platforms around. By a platform, I mean whether it's a boat or a plane or a submarine. It carries a certain amount of a payload to do a thing. We keep changing those. We keep changing, for instance, how big they are, how small they are, how far they go. And this causes us all sorts of problems because industry is continually building a slightly bigger thing, a slightly smaller thing. We keep changing the platform part of it. But actually the bit we should be focusing on is its kind of intelligence to do its action, the bit that you're talking about, this autonomy. That doesn't really matter whether it's huge or small or whatever. That's the bit that we really should be able to own.
It's like the brain. Someone said to me about the Chinook. The Chinook's been up in the air for decades, but they keep changing the brain. And it's the same thing for the autonomous system.
Yeah, and the brain on the autonomous system is a combination of what sits on the platform itself and the operators who use it.
Okay.
So I think that would help us massively if we focused on autonomy as that sort of function of humans and machines, as opposed to just chasing around the latest platform, be it very big, very small, whatever.
Okay. Implies, Crawford, do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I think you need to break down the platform into the autonomy itself, as in the brain of the system, the platform, and then the mutual support that they potentially have between them in terms of their operation. There is read across from air, land, maritime, and in fact there's some terrific UK startups doing autonomy in the maritime space. Another area where I think we can develop further autonomy is to take autonomy into synthetic environments, where we can then...
So what is synthetic?
So something like a simulator, so creating a synthetic wartime scenario into which we can put autonomous agents and then see how they perform against either real-time pilots or other actors within that environment, or against other autonomous systems.
You think these are areas where the UK can actually have advantage and should absolutely be sovereign on?
Yeah, I think we definitely have advantage in this area. Okay. I was fortunate to be in a briefing by NVIDIA in the Pentagon in 2017, discussing a very sexy phrase known as generative adversarial networks, where essentially two autonomous agents teach and train each other to develop new capability. And when I did a bit of probing to find out where NVIDIA had got the capability from, it turned out there was a scientist in Cambridge that had actually developed it for them under a subcontract. So I do think we are world leading in this regard, and we should be making more of it.
Interesting. Lord Hutton.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I wonder whether we could turn our attention now to the forthcoming defence investment plan. I mean, we've heard a lot today about the defence industrial strategy. We've got a lot of pretty high-level ideas about the capabilities we want to develop, but we don't really have at the moment an investment pipeline that's going to help us to do that. And I'm assuming we all agree that the defence investment plan will be that pipeline. Could you perhaps set out for us today what you think the defence investment plan needs to focus on if we are going to strengthen the defence industrial base and secure some of these important sovereign capabilities we've been talking about today?
I mean, I guess my take would be, well, what are we trying to achieve with the defence? And I guess we had that questions in the first session, really. But as someone who's I guess spent a long time achieving things that have been directed under a strategy, I would expect to be taught, what does the country want to achieve in order to then have an defence industrial plan to follow through with. If it's autonomous systems, some of that is highlighted in the defence and industrial strategy. Then let's break that down into the various parts that we're weak on. If it's something that we need to do at scale, we're going to need to develop subsystem manufacturing, so we're not relying on other countries in order to deliver it, and then ensure that we incentivize companies to essentially act as integrators for those systems that we have built using UK-based companies. That's how I would see the defence investment plan being of most benefit. Oh, and by the way, set a time frame that's kind of meaningful in order that we can kind of essentially ramp to an effective production rate during that time.
I would think about it in terms of three kind of different areas of sovereign need and capability. The first is around the really most vital technologies for our future. The second is really around the kind of core commodities and industries necessary for our basic resilience. And then the third, and this is probably a little more unusual, is to really think about our strengths in areas of value to our adversaries. And I think on all three of those, the first is the area where we have the greatest natural advantages at the moment. But I think for us to really excel in those, we need a much more active interventionist state that is willing to pick winners. And some of this comes down to the capacity for strategic focus. We have a lot of government objectives at the moment that are conditional. So, for example, if we are looking at ambitions around growth, it might be economic growth, but we also want that to be regionally balanced. I think if we're really getting into a laser focus on sovereign capability, we need to be willing to really double down in areas of strength and actually make hard choices in that respect. I think on that kind of second sphere around core capabilities for fundamental resilience, we have to be able to look at this issue in the round. We have eroded a lot of our manufacturing capability. And if you think about a commodity like steel, we have allowed the sort of fundamental long-term deindustrialization of this, but if you actually think about its totally integral function into so many of our defense capabilities and critical national industries, I think it does really make the point about why you need that holistic purview. I think we also, we've already mentioned procurement, so I won't go into that, but I do think another challenge that needs to be addressed in this defense investment plan is we do have a problem in building the next generation of companies, because we have an amazing ability to generate startups. We have really, really outstanding startups, but we're not allowing anything to move from the S to the M in the SMEs, so they're vulnerable to acquisition, and that is a really crucial point at which we're losing sovereign capability. And then just on the third dimension around our adversaries, I think that it's going to be really, really crucial for us to shift our conception of value from always starting with our own indigenous conception of value to also accommodating perceptions of value from our adversaries. And I think that is the only way that we can actually move away from constantly being in this reactive posture.
Edwin Morelli?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to link up a couple of things with the previous panel and what you've been talking about in terms of sovereign capability, and thinking especially about Air Commodore, which is about this sort of this desire for sovereign capability and strengthening the defence industrial base, and whether or not you feel that actually the UK government or the MOD or whoever you want to point the finger at, to what level do we have a granular understanding of the sort of full UK supply chain capability, capacity, potential for a whole society solution if you do need to switch manufacturing from, I think your example was wardrobes to the ends of drones. I mean, actually, does your sense of being inside government make you feel that we do understand that, or do we not?
I think we're definitely making progress with it. If you'd asked me 18 months ago, I would have said probably not, but there has been significant work since. I tend to describe sovereignty into two brackets. There is sovereignty for the economy, so getting after steel making, etc., things that enhance our economic growth. And then there is sovereignty in terms of defence, security and national resiliency. And I think going back to that point about making it a whole-of-nation approach, there's a line in there about the fact that data, comms and energy resiliency underpin both defence and national security, but also the economy. And if you're not getting after those, then you're not supporting either. And this then relates then to the point that Lord Sebwell made about how you link together investment in defence and economic growth and try and make them one and the same thing. So that they're linked in terms of the sovereign capabilities that underpin them, but then also how you turn that into capability for growth downstream. I think in terms of where that work needs to be done, there is obviously work that needs to be done, I would argue, within the Cabinet Office in terms of national resiliency, but within the security sector and the security agencies alongside defence, we need to understand what needs to be sovereign for our own activities, and there will be synergies between all three, and I think we can work collectively to get after those synergies. I do think then there is an area of compromise where, for example, we have collaborated with the United States on nuclear capability going right back to World War II. We need to continue that collaboration. So we need to then rack and stack in terms of risk assessment what needs to be purest sovereign in terms of underpinning our own national resiliency, and then what we can afford on a risk-based assessment to collaborate on with allies and partners to get after.
Sophia, I was really interested in your third pillar that you described, and you talked about strengths in areas of values to our adversary. And I wondered whether you could unpick that a little bit by giving an example, and whether you see it as being the same thing as the choke points and the knowledge value that the previous witnesses were talking about.
I think in one ways you can see it manifest in the small yard, high fence approach that had been taken amongst Western allies over recent years towards China. And there's a reason why that concept gained such foothold, because it's institutionally convenient. It is much easier for us to say that we will really go in hard and ring fence certain things, because the implication is that then so many other areas are safe. And the problem with that is you have a list of things that you want to ring fence, means that you are really still fundamentally operating from a principle of openness and an asterisk of caution, whereas I think it should be the other way around, frankly. And, I think an area you could see this was in around semiconductors, the Newport wafer fab decision in Wales was a really interesting example of that. We were able to use the new powers that had come in under the National Security Investment Act and so on to call in that decision, and ultimately the Chinese owned takeover of that plant was blocked. But that was an example of something that was actually outside of the purview of that small yard with the high fence that we created, because we'd said actually it's going to be the most sophisticated semiconductor chips that we will protect. But actually, China had identified that those other chips, so those sort of legacy chips, are also really vital in batteries for electric cars and all sorts of other commodities and uses. So I think that's why I think it's very helpful for us to institutionalize this concept of adversarial value systems and to really challenge our thinking, because frankly our adversaries have been very exploratory in their acquisition of assets and commodities, and we are always reactive and addressing gaps in the past. I think until we can be fully confident that we have the capacity for foresight and to think in an anticipatory way about this, then I think it's better for us to just instill a principle of caution and really invest in understanding what's of value to them.
I just want us to move on. We've got a hard stop, I'm afraid, at 6 o'clock. Baroness Tyler, if you could just ask a brief question, and then we'll have one more.
Thank you. And I do apologise if you've already covered this. But I just wanted to ask, it's really about international collaboration. And the National Security Strategy specifically talks about AUKUS as an example of international collaboration. I wondered what lessons you thought the UK should learn from the way AUKUS has operated, and indeed other partnerships, for future international capability collaborations that will actually strengthen UK national security.
Well, the first thing that I would say is it comes back to the point on Ukraine. You have to have political leadership from the very, very top to galvanize the system. And I think we've had some challenges with AUKUS delivery pipeline, and that's frankly because we've been trying to optimize our systems for a project that is fundamentally disruptive. So you have to have the political leadership to allow the system to embrace that disruption. I think AUKUS and NGCAP is what's interesting about them. They're both Euro-Atlantic, Indo-Pacific collaboration projects. So I think that's something that we should be really looking as a model moving forward. What you see, I mean, there's so many lessons, but I think just a couple to highlight. You need a balance between bureaucracy and delivery. So a lot of attention in AUKUS has gone to creating this well-functioning trilateral bureaucracy, which absorbs a lot of attention away from the urgency of that original mission of pace and mass. So I think you have to make sure that these processes can be nimble and adaptive. You don't want a collaborative project to be held hostage to the weakest link. We've tried to move at this trilateral pace all the time, where we always try and have this kind of balance between producer and consumer, actually really working out who is good at what and dividing up around strategic advantage and contribution is a better way to go.
I'm going to have to interject because we've got like 30 seconds. Lord Robertson, briefly.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, and I'm sorry to have been away. And this is really for the two former service personnel, because all three of us have a little experience of defence procurement, which in my opinion always falls short. Ukraine, they develop things in a month, a week. What do you think about defence procurement in the UK?
I mean, I guess firstly I would say that we can equally do the same. We just pull ourselves... We don't, but we can. We just pull ourselves apart in terms of how our kind of functions and our structures work. Yeah, I mean, same in the US. If the driving measurement of performance here is speed, why wouldn't we be able to do that equally as we can, in my opinion?
We have done it. We did EW capabilities for Ukraine in 4 weeks. We converted Raven from an air-to-air system into a surface-to-air system in 10 weeks when industry said it would take over a year. The main blocker to that was bureaucracy and process, and we managed to overcome that by basically cutting through all of the red tape. Organizational culture is an essential moderating factor in order to deliver that. I think we do have the same challenge as the US, and if you listen to the Secretary of State for War, Hegseth's speech Friday a week ago, where they have replaced the priority of compliance with one of speed, and we have the same problem here.
Thank you very much, very much.
That's very, very helpful. I'm sorry that this session has been so disrupted, but thank you for your forbearance. Can I thank also colleagues actually for hanging on and ensuring we retain chorusy despite the whole series of votes. That concludes our second panel and today's session. Thank you once again. Perhaps we could write to you with some further questions if that's okay, because I'm sorry I had to curtail some of the answers during that session. So if you wouldn't mind responding to that. Thank you again for your time. Order.